The wind carried dust across the small cemetery on the outskirts of Miles City, Montana, and Eleanor Nowell had stopped noticing how it stung her eyes days ago. She knelt beside the fresh grave with its simple wooden marker, her black mourning dress collecting the pale earth like a second skin, and wondered if grief had a limit or if it would stretch on forever like the endless prairie beyond. Her younger brother Thomas had been only 19 when the fever took him, too young to die, too vibrant to be reduced to nothing but carved letters and turned soil. She pressed her palm flat against the dirt, willing herself to feel something other than the hollow ache that had settled in her chest, but the ground offered no comfort, only silence. The year was 1884, and Miles City had grown from a rough military outpost into a bustling cattle town where fortunes were made and lost with each passing season. Eleanor had arrived here with Thomas 2 years prior after their parents succumbed to illness back in Missouri, hoping the Montana Territory would offer them a fresh start and opportunities their old life could never provide. Thomas had found work at the livery stable, his easy smile and natural way, with horses making him popular among the ranchers and cowboys who passed through town. Eleanor had taken a position as a seamstress at Mrs. Harrigan's dress shop, and together they had built a modest but happy existence in their small rented room above the general store. Now Thomas was gone, claimed by scarlet fever in less than a week, and Eleanor felt as though half her soul had been buried alongside him. She came to the cemetery every day now, arriving at dawn and often staying until the sun hung low in the western sky. The townspeople had stopped offering their condolences after the first few days, recognizing that Eleanor needed space to wrestle with her sorrow in her own way. Mrs. Harrigan had been understanding about her absence from the shop, telling Eleanor to take all the time she needed, but Eleanor knew that patience would eventually wear thin. She would have to return to the world of the living soon, would have to learn how to exist in a reality where Thomas no longer walked beside her, but not yet. Not when his death still felt like an open wound that might never heal. It was on the 5th morning of her vigil that she first noticed him. The cowboy appeared at the cemetery gates just after sunrise, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that fell past his collar. He carried his hat in his hands as he walked among the graves, his boots making soft sounds against the hard-packed earth, and Eleanor felt an unexpected flash of irritation at the intrusion. She had come to think of this place as hers alone, a sanctuary where she could grieve without witnesses, and the presence of a stranger felt like a violation. She kept her gaze fixed on Thomas's grave, hoping the cowboy would conclude his business and leave her in peace. But he did not leave. Instead, she heard his footsteps drawing closer, and then he was standing a respectful distance away, close enough that she could not ignore him, but far enough to avoid crowding her space. Eleanor refused to look up, keeping her attention on the wooden marker she had traced with her fingers. So many times she knew every groove and knot in the wood. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, until finally the cowboy spoke. "I lost my brother too," he said, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. 4 years back, shot in a dispute over cards in a saloon down in Wyoming. He was 22. The words struck Eleanor with unexpected force, breaking through the wall she had built around herself. She finally lifted her gaze to meet his, taking in the weathered face marked by sun and hardship, the dark eyes that held a sadness matching her own. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with the lean build of a man who spent his life in the saddle, and there was a quiet steadiness about him that made her throat tighten. "I am sorry for your loss," she managed, her voice cracking slightly from disuse. She had barely spoken in days beyond a few words to the shop owner who sold her bread and cheese. The cowboy nodded, his gaze drifting to Thomas's grave. "Name was Samuel. He was my younger brother, followed me out west thinking it would be an adventure. I should have sent him back home, should have known he was not cut out for the rough life out here, but I was too proud to admit I had made a mistake dragging him along." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared pain and regret. "My brother Thomas died of scarlet fever," she said quietly. "I keep thinking if I had noticed the signs sooner, if I had called for the doctor earlier, maybe things would have been different." "Maybe," the cowboy said, "or maybe it was just his time, and there was nothing you could have done to change it. That is what folks told me after Samuel died, though I did not believe them for a long while. Do you believe them now?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Some days, Other days I still wake up thinking about all the things I should have done differently." He looked at her directly then, and Eleanor saw understanding in his expression. "But I learned that staying rooted in one place, holding on to the grief like it is all you have left of them, that only makes the pain last longer. Your brother would not want you wasting away out here in this cemetery." Eleanor felt a flash of anger rise in her throat. "You do not know what my brother would have wanted. You did not know him." "You are right, I did not," the cowboy said calmly, not rising to her defensive tone. "But I knew Samuel, and I know he would have hated seeing me destroy myself over his death. I imagine most folks who love us do not want us to suffer on their account." The truth of his words cut through her anger, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. Eleanor looked back at the grave, at the name carved into the wood. "I do not know how to let him go." "You do not have to let him go," the cowboy said. "You just have to learn how to carry him with you instead of leaving pieces of yourself here in the ground." He fell silent for a moment, then added, "I come here most mornings when I'm in town. There is a grave over by that cottonwood tree, belongs to a man named Jack Mullins. He was foreman on the first ranch I worked when I came to Montana. Taught me everything worth knowing about cattle and horses in this land. Died 3 years ago when his horse threw him and broke his neck." Eleanor glanced toward the cottonwood, then back at the cowboy. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that if you are here tomorrow morning, you will not be alone, and maybe having someone who understands might make it a bit easier." He settled his hat back on his head and touched the brim in a gesture of farewell. "Name is Ryder Young, by the way. I work for the Double Bar Ranch about 10 miles north of here." Before Eleanor could respond, he turned and walked away, his spurs making soft music with each step. She watched him go, feeling off balance and uncertain. Part of her resented his intrusion, his presumption that she needed or wanted company in her grief. But another part, a part she was hesitant to acknowledge, felt the tiniest flicker of something other than sorrow. Not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what it felt like to connect with another human being. The next morning, Eleanor returned to the cemetery as dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. She told herself she was coming for Thomas, to spend another day beside his grave, but she could not deny the small flutter of anticipation when she spotted Ryder Young standing beside the cottonwood tree. He raised a hand in greeting, but did not approach, giving her the space to settle beside Thomas's marker and begin her quiet communion with the brother she had lost. An hour passed, maybe 2, before Ryder walked over carrying 2 tin cups. The smell of coffee reached Eleanor before he did, rich and dark and comforting. "Thought you could use something warm," he said, offering her one of the cups. "Gets cold out here in the mornings, even in summer." Eleanor hesitated, then accepted the cup, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. "Thank you." Ryder sat down several feet away, close enough for conversation, but still respecting her space. He sipped his own coffee and looked out across the cemetery, not pressing her to talk. The silence between them felt different than it had the day before, less weighted with tension and more simply companionable. Eleanor found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, noting the way the morning light caught in his dark hair, the strong line of his jaw, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work and long days. "Tell me about Thomas," Ryder said eventually. "What was he like?" The question surprised Eleanor. Most people avoided mentioning the dead, as if speaking their names might somehow deepen the wound. But there was genuine curiosity in Ryder's voice, a real desire to know. Eleanor took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "He was kind," she said slowly. "The sort of person who could not walk past a stray dog without stopping to pet it, or a child without making them laugh. He had this way of seeing the good in everyone, even when they did not deserve it." She smiled slightly, remembering. "When we first arrived in Miles City, there was a man at the boarding house who was mean as a snake, always complaining and finding fault with everyone. But Thomas struck up a conversation with him one day and discovered the man had lost his wife and daughter to cholera. After that, Thomas would sit with him in the evenings, just talking, and the man became almost pleasant. That was Thomas. He could find the hurt in people and somehow make it better." "Sounds like someone worth grieving for," Ryder said quietly. "He was everything," Eleanor whispered. "After our parents died, he was all the family I had left in the world. Now, I have no one." Ryder was quiet for a moment, then said, "You have yourself. That counts for something." Eleanor wanted to argue, to tell him that having only herself felt like having nothing at all, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she drank more coffee and let the silence return, finding it less oppressive than before. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. Eleanor would arrive at the cemetery at dawn, Ryder would appear with coffee, and they would sit together in the growing light, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in shared grief. Ryder told her about his life on the Double Bar Ranch, about the cattle drives and the endless work of keeping thousands of head fed and safe from predators and rustlers. He spoke of the land with a reverence that surprised Eleanor, describing the rolling prairie and distant mountains as though they were living things worthy of respect and wonder. "I came out here from Texas 5 years ago," he told her one morning. "Thought I would work for a season, save some money, then head back home. But something about this country got into my blood. The size of it, the way you can ride for days and see nothing but grass and sky. Makes you feel small, but in a good way. Like your problems are not as big as they seem when you are standing in the middle of all that space." "I felt the opposite when we first arrived," Eleanor admitted. "All that emptiness terrified me. In Missouri, there were always people around, houses close together, civilization. Out here, it felt like we were perched on the edge of the world with nothing to catch us if we fell." "And now?" Ryder asked. Eleanor considered the question, surprised to find her answer had changed. "Now, I think I am beginning to understand what you mean. The space does not feel threatening anymore. It feels honest, like the land is not pretending to be anything other than what it is." Ryder smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something warmer. "That is exactly it. The land does not lie to you. It is hard and beautiful and dangerous, but it is real in a way that nothing back east ever was." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself looking forward to the mornings with Ryder. His presence had shifted from an intrusion to a comfort, and she began to notice details about him that had escaped her initial grief-clouded perception. The way he always approached quietly, never startling her. How he listened when she talked about Thomas, really listened without offering empty platitudes or trying to rush her through her morning. The gentle way he handled the tin coffee cups, as though afraid of disturbing the peace of the cemetery. She found herself wondering about him during the long afternoons, about what his life was like on the ranch, whether he had family somewhere, if he was lonely in the way she had become so familiar with. On the 10th day of her vigil, Eleanor arrived at the cemetery to find Ryder already there, standing beside Thomas's grave with his hat pressed to his chest. For a moment, panic seized her, an irrational fear that something had happened to desecrate the grave, but as she drew closer, she saw that everything was intact. Ryder had simply come early. "I wanted to pay my respects," he said as she approached. "Even though I never knew him, your Thomas sounds like he was a good man. Thought he deserved acknowledgement from someone besides family." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had shed in days. She had cried so much in the beginning that she thought she had exhausted her capacity for tears, but Ryder's simple gesture cracked something open inside her. "That is the kindest thing anyone has done since he died," she managed. Ryder looked uncomfortable with her gratitude, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Just seemed right. They stood together beside the grave, and Eleanor felt a shift occurring within her, a loosening of the tight grip grief had maintained on her heart. Thomas was still gone, would always be gone, but the pain had changed shape, becoming something she could carry rather than something that pinned her in place. "I think I need to go back to work tomorrow," she said quietly. "Mrs. Harrigan has been patient, but I cannot hide out here forever." "That is good," Ryder said. "But you can still come visit, just maybe not all day, every day." Eleanor nodded. "Will you still be here in the mornings?" "I leave for a cattle drive in 3 days," Ryder said. "We'll be gone for near about 6 weeks. But when I get back, if you are still in Miles City, I would like to see you again. Not just here at the cemetery, but maybe in town. Maybe I could buy you dinner at the hotel restaurant." The invitation caught Eleanor off guard. She had been so consumed by grief that she had not recognized what was developing between them, but now, stated plainly, she could not deny the connection that had formed. She looked at Ryder, really looked at him, and saw not just a kind stranger who had kept her company in her sorrow, but a man she wanted to know better, whose presence had begun to matter in a way that went beyond shared mourning. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." Ryder's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. "Good. That is real good, Eleanor. The next morning, Eleanor returned to work at Mrs. Harrigan's dress shop. The older woman embraced her tightly, asking no questions, simply putting her back to work on the alterations that had piled up during her absence. Eleanor found comfort in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread, in the precision required to take in a waist or hem, a skirt. Her hands remembered the work even when her mind wandered, drifting to thoughts of Ryder and the unexpected gift his presence had become. She still visited Thomas's grave each morning before work, but Ryder was right. The daily visits felt different now, less like a vigil and more like a conversation with someone she loved who simply could not answer back. She told Thomas about Ryder, about how a stranger had become something more, and though the grave offered no response, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she had not known since her brother's death. Thomas would have approved, she thought. He had always wanted her to be happy, to find someone who would stand beside her the way she had stood beside him. Ryder appeared at the cemetery for the next 2 mornings, bringing coffee and conversation before he had to leave for the cattle drive. On the 3rd morning, their last before his departure, the air between them felt charged with unspoken words and unexplored possibilities. 6 weeks is a long time, Eleanor said as they sat together in the growing light. It is, Ryder agreed, but I will be back. You have my word on that. What if things are different when you return? What if what we have found here does not translate to the real world? Ryder reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. It was the first time they had touched beyond the passing of coffee cups, and Eleanor felt the contact all the way to her bones. Then we will figure it out together, he said. But I do not think things will be different. I think what we have is real, cemetery or no cemetery. Eleanor squeezed his hand, drawing courage from his certainty. I will be here when you get back, I promise. I will hold you to that, Ryder said, and there was something fierce in his voice, a determination that made Eleanor's heart skip. They parted ways as the sun climbed higher, and Eleanor watched Ryder walk away, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared beyond the cemetery gates. She felt the absence immediately, a new kind of ache that was entirely different from grief, but no less intense. She had not expected to care for anyone again, so soon after Thomas's death, had not thought herself capable of making space in her heart for new feelings. But Ryder had slipped past her defenses without her even realizing it was happening. The weeks that followed were strange and suspended. Eleanor threw herself into her work at the dress shop, taking on extra projects to keep her hands and mind occupied. She befriended some of the other young women in town, accepting invitations to church socials and community dinners that she had previously declined. She still visited Thomas's grave several times a week, but the visits were shorter now, less consuming. She was learning, slowly, how to live with loss instead of drowning in it. She thought about Ryder constantly, wondering where he was, what he was seeing, whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. She had known him for less than 2 weeks, had shared nothing more than coffee and conversation, but something about their connection felt significant, as though they had been meant to find each other in that cemetery on that particular morning. 5 weeks passed, then 6. Eleanor found herself watching the road leading into town, hoping to spot familiar riders returning from the trail. Mrs. Harrigan teased her gently about being distracted, noting that Eleanor had rehemmed the same skirt 3 times because she kept losing track of her measurements. There is a young man involved, I take it, Mrs. Harrigan said, her eyes twinkling. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Perhaps. We have not actually spent time together outside the cemetery. I am not even sure you could call it courting. If you are thinking about him this much, it is something, Mrs. Harrigan said. And about time, if you ask me. You are too young to spend your life in mourning. Your brother would want you to be happy. That is what Ryder said, the young man, I mean. Smart fellow, then, Mrs. Harrigan said approvingly. When does he return? Any day now, I hope. It was another 4 days before Eleanor saw Ryder again. She was leaving the dress shop at the end of a long day, her shoulders aching from hours bent over fine embroidery, when she heard her name called. She turned to find Ryder striding down the wooden sidewalk toward her, dusty from the trail, but grinning like she was the best sight he had seen in weeks. You are back, she said, unable to keep the joy from her voice. Just rode in an hour ago, Ryder said, stopping a few feet away as though unsure of his welcome. I had to stable my horse and report to the ranch boss, but then I came straight here hoping to catch you before you went home. Eleanor wanted to close the distance between them, to touch him and confirm he was real and not just a figure from her imagination. But she was aware of the people passing on the street, the curious glances being thrown their way. Small-town gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and she was not quite ready to be the subject of speculation. "Would you like to take a walk?" she suggested. "There is a path along the river that is quite pleasant in the evening." "I would like that very much," Ryder said. They walked side by side through town, maintaining a respectable distance but close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from him. Once they reached the river path and left the prying eyes of Main Street behind, Ryder offered his arm and Eleanor took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her hand. "How was the drive?" she asked. "Long, hot. We lost about 30 head to a river crossing that went bad, and one of the hands broke his leg when his horse stepped in a hole. But overall it was successful. The cattle made it to market in good shape, and the ranch will turn a decent profit." He paused, then added, "But I thought about you the entire time. Every morning when I was drinking my coffee, I wished you were there beside me." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "I thought about you too. Constantly, actually. Mrs. Harrigan says I have been distracted. Good distracted or bad distracted?" "Good," Eleanor said softly. "Definitely good." They walked in silence for a while, following the curve of the river as the setting sun turned the water to gold. Eleanor felt a contentment she had not experienced in months, a sense of rightness that came from being with someone who understood her and accepted her grief without trying to fix it or rush her past it. "I meant what I said before I left," Ryder said eventually, "about wanting to court you properly. I know we met under unusual circumstances, and I know you are still grieving your brother, but I would like the chance to see where this goes between us." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him. In the golden light, Ryder looked almost unbearably handsome, his dark eyes serious and hopeful. "I would like that too," she said, "but I need you to understand that I am still finding my way. Some days are harder than others. Some days I wake up and forget for a moment that Thomas is gone, and then I remember and it feels like losing him all over again." "I understand," Ryder said. "I told you I lost Samuel 4 years ago. But the truth is I still have days when I see something I know he would have loved, or I hear a joke he would have laughed at, and the grief comes back fresh as the day he died. That does not go away. You just learn to live alongside it." "Then we will learn together," Eleanor said. Ryder smiled and reached up to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I would like to kiss you," he said quietly, "but only if you want that too." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. She had been kissed before, brief stolen moments with a boy back in Missouri before her parents died. But this felt different. This felt important. "Yes," she whispered. "I want that." Ryder leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind. But Eleanor stood steady, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise and possibility. And when they finally pulled apart, Eleanor felt like she was glowing from the inside out. "I have wanted to do that since the 3rd morning at the cemetery," Ryder admitted, his voice rough. "Why did you wait so long?" Eleanor asked, smiling. "Because you needed time to grieve, and I needed to know this was real, and not just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's pain." "And now I know it is real," Ryder said. "Real as anything I have ever felt." They kissed again, longer this time, and Eleanor felt the last of her reservations crumble away. She had not been looking for love when she knelt beside Thomas's grave all those mornings ago. She had been looking for a way to survive her grief, to find some path forward through the darkness that had engulfed her world. Instead, she had found Ryder, and in finding him, she had found herself again. They began courting officially after that evening by the river. Ryder would ride into town twice a week when his work at the ranch allowed, and they would spend their time together, walking, talking, learning the contours of each other's lives and hearts. Eleanor discovered that Ryder had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had died when Ryder was 16, leaving him and Samuel to fend for themselves. He had worked various ranches across Texas and Wyoming before landing in Montana, always searching for something he could not name until he met Eleanor. "I think I was looking for a place to belong," he told her one evening as they sat on the steps of the boarding house where she now rented a room. "The ranch is good, and I like the work, but it never felt permanent. I always figured I would move on eventually, find something else. But now, I cannot imagine leaving Miles City. Not when you are here." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. "I never wanted to come to Montana," she admitted. "Thomas was the one with dreams of the West. I just wanted to stay in Missouri where everything was familiar and safe. But he convinced me to come with him, said we would build a better life out here. And he was right, even if he is not here to see it." "He sees it," Ryder said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I believe that. I think the people we love stay with us in ways we cannot see or measure." Eleanor thought about that often in the weeks that followed. She thought about Thomas when she laughed at something Ryder said, wondering if her brother approved of the man who had won her heart. She thought about him when she lay awake at night, imagining a future that included marriage and children and a home of her own. She thought about him when she visited his grave, telling him about her life with Ryder, the way she had once told him about her day over dinner in their small rented room. Summer faded into autumn, and Ryder's courtship grew more serious. He spoke of building a house on a piece of land he had been saving to purchase, 100 acres with good water and grass for cattle. He spoke of Eleanor as though her presence in that future home was a foregone conclusion, and she did nothing to discourage him because she wanted it too, wanted it with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. On a crisp October morning, 6 months after they first met, Ryder came to town carrying a small wooden box. Eleanor was working at the dress shop when he arrived, and Mrs. Harrigan took one look at his face and shooed Eleanor out the door. "Go on," the older woman said, her eyes bright with knowing. "I can manage without you for an hour." Ryder took Eleanor's hand and led her to the cemetery, to the space beneath the cottonwood tree where they had spent so many mornings together. Thomas's grave was nearby, the wooden marker weathered now, but still legible, and Eleanor felt the rightness of this moment, of Ryder choosing this place to ask the question she knew was coming. "I should probably do this somewhere more romantic," Ryder said, turning the wooden box over in his hands. "Take you to a fancy restaurant or wait for a sunset on the prairie. But this place matters to us. This is where we began, where you let me see your grief and where I let you see mine. This is where we learned how to be honest with each other." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears, the kind that came from joy rather than sorrow. "I love this place," she said. "I love what it represents for us." Ryder opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, unadorned but beautiful in its straightforward honesty. "Eleanor Nowell, I am not a fancy man, and I cannot promise you an easy life. Ranch work is hard, and Montana winters are brutal, and there will be days when money is tight and the future looks uncertain. But I can promise you that I will love you fiercely and faithfully for the rest of my days. I will honor the brother you lost and the grief you carry. I will build you a home and fill it with laughter and children if you want them. I will stand beside you in every storm and celebrate with you in every joy. Will you marry me?" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain. "Yes, absolutely yes." Ryder slipped the ring onto her finger, and then they were kissing, holding each other as the autumn wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves overhead. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor glanced toward Thomas's grave. "I think he approves," she said softly. "I hope so," Ryder replied, "because I plan on making you happy for a very long time." They were married in December, a small ceremony at the church in Miles City with Mrs. Harrigan and the ranch hands from the double bar in attendance. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, and Ryder wore his best suit, his dark hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Ryder kissed her, Eleanor felt the pieces of her fractured world finally clicking back into place. They spent their wedding night at the hotel in town, a luxury Ryder insisted on, even though money was tight. In the morning, they would travel to the land Ryder had purchased, where a small cabin stood waiting, but for this one night, they allowed themselves to exist in a bubble of intimacy and newness, learning the geography of each other's bodies, whispering promises and hopes into the darkness. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Eleanor confessed, as they lay tangled together in the narrow hotel bed. "After Thomas died, I felt like my capacity for love had died with him. But you showed me that grief and love can exist side by side, that opening your heart to new joy does not mean abandoning the memory of those you have lost." Ryder traced patterns on her shoulder, his touch gentle and reverent. "You saved me too," he said. "I was drifting before I met you, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. You reminded me what it means to connect with someone, to care about something beyond the next job or the next paycheck." They made love again as dawn light crept through the curtains, slow and tender, sealing the promises they had spoken at the altar. Afterward, Eleanor rested her head on Ryder's chest, listening to the steady thump of his heartbeat, and felt a peace so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. The cabin on their new land was small but sturdy, built from rough-hewn logs and chinked with mud and moss. It consisted of one large room with a stone fireplace, a smaller bedroom, and a loft that could be used for storage or future children. The windows were small to keep out the winter cold, and the floor was packed dirt covered with wooden planks in places, but Eleanor loved it immediately. This was theirs, built by Ryder's hands, a sanctuary they would fill with their life together. The first winter was hard. Montana cold was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in Missouri, a bone-deep chill that seeped through layers of clothing and made every task twice as difficult. Ryder worked long hours in brutal conditions, caring for the small herd of cattle they had purchased, with the money from his cattle drive wages and Eleanor's savings. Eleanor kept the cabin warm and cooked meals that would stick to their ribs, made candles and soap, and mended their clothes until she could mend them no more. But there were moments of profound beauty too, nights when they would stand outside and watch the northern lights dance across the sky, ribbons of green and purple that seemed to pulse with otherworldly life. Mornings when Eleanor would wake to find Ryder had already stoked the fire and brought in fresh water. Little acts of care that spoke louder than words. Evenings when they would sit together by the fireplace, Ryder reading aloud from the newspaper while Eleanor sewed, the silence between them comfortable and complete. Eleanor still thought about Thomas, especially during the darkest part of winter when grief seemed to settle heavier on her shoulders. But now when she mourned, Ryder was there to hold her, to let her cry without trying to fix her sadness, to remind her that loving someone who had died did not mean she could not also love the life she was building. In February, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The signs had been there for weeks, but she had been afraid to hope, afraid that acknowledging the possibility might somehow jinx it. But when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the third time and her breasts became tender and swollen, she could no longer deny the truth. She told Ryder that evening after supper, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. They had spoken about children, about filling the cabin with noise and laughter, but the reality of it felt enormous and overwhelming. Ryder's face transformed when she spoke the words, joy and wonder mingling with something that looked like fear. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Ryder said, pulling her into his arms and burying his face in her hair. "I am terrified and thrilled, and so grateful I can barely breathe. A baby. Our baby." They held each other for a long time, and Eleanor felt Thomas's presence like a blessing, as though her brother was watching over them from wherever the dead went, smiling at this new chapter of her life. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Eleanor's belly swelled, her body changing in ways both wonderful and strange. Ryder became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more and work less, hovering whenever she climbed the ladder to the loft or carried water from the well. Eleanor found his concern endearing even when it bordered on excessive. In late August, Eleanor's labor began. Ryder had arranged for a midwife from town to stay with them the last few weeks of the pregnancy, an older woman named Mrs. Peterson, who had delivered half the babies in Custer County. She took charge immediately when Eleanor's pains started, ordering Ryder to heat water and fetch towels while she examined Eleanor and pronounced everything progressing normally. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, long hours of pain and effort that tested Eleanor's strength and resolve. Ryder stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping the sweat from her brow, whispering encouragement when she wanted to give up. "You can do this," he told her during a particularly brutal contraction. "You are the strongest person I know. You survived losing everyone you loved and built a whole new life. You can do this." Finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, Eleanor gave one final push, and their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. Mrs. Peterson cleaned and wrapped the infant, then placed the tiny bundle in Eleanor's arms. "You have a son," the midwife announced. A healthy, beautiful boy. Eleanor looked down at the red-faced infant and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. He was perfect, from his downy dark hair to his tiny grasping fingers, and she loved him with an intensity that was almost painful. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Ryder leaned over them both, his eyes wet with tears. "He is perfect. You are perfect." He kissed Eleanor's forehead, then gently touched his son's cheek. "What should we name him?" Eleanor had thought about this throughout her pregnancy, considering and discarding dozens of names. But now, looking at the tiny life they had created, only one name felt right. "Thomas," she said softly. "We should name him Thomas, after my brother." Ryder nodded, understanding immediately. "Thomas Young. It is a good, strong name." Eleanor looked at her son, at this new Thomas who would carry her brother's name into the future, and felt a sense of completion she had been seeking since that terrible day when fever stole her brother away. The old Thomas was gone, would never come back, but his memory would live on in this child, in the stories she would tell, and the love she would pour into raising him right. Mrs. Peterson stayed for 3 more days, teaching Eleanor how to nurse and care for the baby, making sure both mother and child were healthy before she returned to town. Once they were alone, just the 3 of them in the little cabin, Eleanor and Ryder began to navigate the strange new world of parenthood. It was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Baby Thomas woke every few hours to nurse, his cries splitting the night and leaving Eleanor foggy with sleep deprivation. But there were also moments of transcendent joy, like when Ryder would hold his son and sing old cowboy ballads in his rough voice, or when Thomas would lock eyes with Eleanor during feeding, his tiny face serious and intent. The seasons turned, autumn giving way to another brutal winter, and the young family settled into the rhythms of their life. Ryder worked the ranch with help from 2 hired hands he had taken on as the herd grew, and Eleanor managed the household while caring for Thomas. It was a hard life, full of early mornings and physical labor, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way Eleanor had never experienced in her old existence in Missouri. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, Eleanor bundled the baby in warm blankets and rode into town with Ryder to visit the cemetery. The grave marker had been replaced with a proper headstone, granite carved with Thomas Nowell's name and dates, a gift Ryder had commissioned without telling Eleanor. She stood beside the grave holding her son, telling her brother about the life she had built, the love she had found, the family she was raising. "I hope you can see us," she said quietly. "I hope you know that I am happy, that I found my way through the grief to something beautiful, and I hope you do not mind that we name the baby after you. It felt important to keep your name alive in the world." Ryder stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and together they honored the man who had brought Eleanor to Montana, whose death had inadvertently led her to the cemetery where she met Ryder. "Thank you," Ryder said to the grave, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for being the kind of brother who taught Eleanor how to love deeply and fiercely. Thank you for bringing her west, even if you could not stay to see what she made of it. And thank you for whatever you did in the beyond to bring us together. I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never regrets choosing me." They returned to the ranch as snow began to fall, fat flakes drifting from a gray sky. Eleanor held baby Thomas close, protecting him from the cold, and thought about how life moved in circles, how grief and joy intertwined, how the people we lost continued to shape us long after they were gone. The years passed, marked by the turning of seasons and the milestones of family life. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, then a boy, bright and curious with his father's dark eyes and his mother's quick smile. 2 years after Thomas was born, Eleanor delivered a daughter they named Clara, a tiny replica of Eleanor with fair hair and delicate features. 3 years after Clara came another boy, Samuel, named for Ryder's lost brother, completing their family. The ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to one of the most successful in the region. Ryder hired more hands and built a larger house, a proper 2-story structure with real glass windows and wooden floors throughout. But they kept the original cabin, using it as a guest house and a reminder of where they had started, of the life they had built, from grief and hope and stubborn determination. Eleanor became a pillar of the Miles City community, known for her kindness and her skill with a needle. She took in sewing work and trained other women in the art of dressmaking, building a small business that gave her independence and purpose beyond motherhood. She also worked to establish a proper school in town, organizing fundraisers and petitioning the territorial government until they secured funding for a teacher and a building. Through it all, she and Ryder remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with time and shared experience. They still took walks by the river on summer evenings, still sat together by the fire on winter nights, still found ways to steal moments of intimacy amidst the chaos of raising 3 children and running a ranch. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder took Eleanor back to the cemetery where they had met. The children were old enough to stay with Mrs. Harrigan for the day, and Eleanor and Ryder spent the morning walking among the graves, remembering. "I have never told you this," Ryder said as they stood beside the cottonwood tree, "but I almost did not come to the cemetery that first morning I saw you. I had been avoiding it for weeks, feeling like visiting Jack's grave was a waste of time, like dwelling in the past would not change anything. But something made me come that day, some instinct I cannot explain, and there you were." "I almost did not come back after you spoke to me that first time," Eleanor admitted. "Part of me resented you for intruding on my grief, for suggesting that I should not spend every moment beside Thomas's grave. But another part, a part I was not ready to acknowledge, recognized something in you, saw a kindred spirit who understood what I was feeling." "Fate," Ryder said. "That is what I call it. We were meant to find each other, meant to heal each other, meant to build this life together." Eleanor nodded, then led him to Thomas's grave. The headstone had weathered over the years, the carved letters slightly softened by wind and rain, but it remained a solid presence, a marker of a life that had been too short but deeply loved. "I used to come here every day," she said. "In those first years after we were married, I would ride into town at least once a week to visit. But as the children came and life got busier, the visits became less frequent. Now, I sometimes go months without coming here, and I used to feel guilty about that, like I was forgetting Thomas or dishonoring his memory." "But you are not," Ryder said. "You carry him with you every day in the son who bears his name, in the stories you tell the children about their uncle, in the way you live your life with the same kindness and generosity he showed. This grave is just a marker. Thomas himself lives in your heart." "You are right," Eleanor said. "I know you are right, but I still like to come here sometimes, to remember, to tell him about our life." "Then we will keep coming," Ryder promised, "as long as you need to, as long as it brings you comfort." They stood together in the autumn sunshine, hands clasped, we surrounded by the dead, but feeling vibrantly, completely alive. Eleanor thought about the young woman she had been a decade ago, broken by grief and unable to imagine a future that did not include crushing sorrow. She thought about how Ryder had appeared, like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying, how he had sat with her in her pain without trying to fix it, how he had shown her that healing did not mean forgetting. "I love you," she said, turning to face him. "I do not say it enough, but I love you more than I can express. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You showed me that joy and sorrow can coexist, that loving someone new does not diminish the love you have for those you have lost. You gave me a family, a home, a future. You gave me everything." Ryder cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "You gave me just as much," he said. "Before I met you, I was hollow. I did not even know how hollow until you filled all those empty spaces with light and laughter and love. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting, to put down roots and claim a place as home. You are my home, Eleanor, you and the children. You are everything that matters." They kissed there among the gravestones, a kiss that held a decade of devotion and partnership that promised decades more to come. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor took one last look at Thomas's grave, said a silent farewell, and turned toward the cemetery gates where Ryder had left their horses tied. The ride back to the ranch was peaceful, the autumn air crisp and clean, the sky an impossible blue. Eleanor thought about her life, about all the unexpected turns that had led her to this moment. If someone had told her 10 years ago that she would find happiness again after losing Thomas, that she would meet a cowboy in a cemetery and fall in love and build a family, she would not have believed them. Grief had felt too permanent, too all-consuming to allow room for anything else. But she had learned that the human heart was more resilient than she ever imagined, that it could hold multitudes, that joy did not erase sorrow, but rather existed alongside it, creating a richer, more complex experience of being alive. She had learned that love came in many forms, that the brother she had lost and the husband she had found could both occupy essential spaces in her soul without competing for dominance. She had learned that healing was not linear, that some days she still woke up missing Thomas, with an ache that stole her breath, but those days no longer defined her existence. When they arrived home, the children rushed out to greet them, Thomas now nearly 11 and already tall like his father, Clara 8 and chattering non-stop about a bird's nest she had found, and Samuel 5 and clinging to Eleanor's skirts. Eleanor scooped Samuel into her arms and let Clara take her hand while Thomas walked alongside Ryder, peppering him with questions about ranch business. That evening, after the children were in bed, Eleanor and Ryder sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The air smelled of hay and horses and the distant promise of winter, and Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost physical. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been if Thomas had not died?" Ryder asked quietly. "If he had recovered from the fever and you two had built your life in Miles City together?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. It was something she had wondered about in the early years, a painful game of what if that had served no purpose except to prolong her suffering. But she had not thought about it in a long time, had made peace with the path her life had actually taken. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I imagine Thomas would have eventually married, maybe taken over the livery stable or started his own business. I imagine we would have remained close, that our children would have been cousins who grew up together. It would have been a good life, I think." "But," Ryder prompted, hearing the unspoken qualifier in her tone. "But it would not have been this life," Eleanor said. "I would not have you or our children, or this ranch, or the depth of understanding I have about grief and resilience and the capacity of the human heart to heal. I would not trade what I have now for anything, even if it meant getting Thomas back. And I think that is okay. I think he would understand that loving the life I have does not mean I did not love him, or that I do not still miss him." Ryder reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think you are right. From everything you have told me about him, Thomas sounds like the kind of person who would want you to be happy above all else." "He was," Eleanor said softly. "He was exactly that kind of person." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams children dream, safe and loved and unaware of the complex history that had brought their parents together. Eleanor thought about the future, about watching Thomas and Clara and Samuel grow up, about eventually becoming grandparents, about growing old with Ryder on this land they had claimed and made their own. It was a future she had not been able to imagine during those dark days in the cemetery, when grief had been her only companion. But Ryder had shown her that futures could be rebuilt, that endings could transform into beginnings, that the cowboy who made sure she was not alone anymore would become the great love of her life. "Thank you," she said suddenly, squeezing Ryder's hand. "For what? For seeing me that day in the cemetery, for bringing me coffee every morning, for being patient with my grief, for showing me that life goes on and that going on does not mean forgetting, for loving me and building this family with me, for everything." Ryder lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "You do not have to thank me for any of that. It has been my privilege and my joy." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, then climbed the stairs to their bedroom, moving quietly to avoid waking the children. Eleanor undressed and slipped into her nightgown, then brushed out her hair while Ryder prepared for bed. These small domestic rituals felt sacred somehow, evidence of the life they had built together through hard work and devotion. In bed, wrapped in Ryder's arms, Eleanor thought about Thomas one more time, sending a prayer of gratitude to wherever he was. "Thank you for bringing me to Montana," she thought. "Thank you for being my brother and my family when I had nothing else. Thank you for dying in a place where a kind cowboy would notice a grieving woman and decide she should not be alone. I hope you know how happy I am. I hope you know that I carry you with me always." The years continued to unfold, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when the cattle died and money was scarce, years when drought threatened their water supply, moments when Eleanor feared they would lose everything they had worked so hard to build. But they weathered each storm together, Ryder and Eleanor united in their determination to provide for their family and honor the second chance life had given them. Young Thomas grew into a fine man, serious and hard-working like his father, but with an innate kindness that reminded Eleanor of the uncle he had been named for. He eventually married a schoolteacher from town, a smart young woman named Margaret who shared his love of the land, and they built a house on the far corner of the ranch property, expanding the family business into the next generation. Clara proved to have her mother's gift with needle and thread, but her true passion was for healing. She became an apprentice to the town doctor, learning medicine and midwifery, eventually taking over his practice when he retired. She married late, at 28, to a banker from back east who had moved to Montana, seeking adventure, and found love instead. Samuel was the wanderer of the family, the dreamer who inherited his namesake's restless spirit. He left home at 20 to try his hand at gold prospecting, then worked as a scout for the Army, then drove cattle from Texas to Kansas, before finally settling in Wyoming, where he started his own horse ranch. But he visited often, always returning to Miles City with stories of his adventures, and a gleam in his eye that reminded Eleanor of Thomas, her Thomas, the brother who had dreamed of the West and made her dream it too. Eleanor and Ryder aged together, their bodies wearing the marks of hard work and harder winters, their faces creasing with lines that mapped decades of laughter and sorrow and everything in between. But their love never wavered, never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something solid and unshakable, a foundation upon which everything else in their lives was built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Eleanor with a trip. He arranged for Thomas and Margaret to manage the ranch, packed bags for both of them, and drove Eleanor in their wagon to the train station in Miles City. They rode the Northern Pacific Railway west to the mountains, to a place Ryder had heard about but never seen, a valley of hot springs where steam rose from pools of crystalline water, and the peaks of the Rocky Mountains loomed overhead like ancient guardians. They spent a week there, just the two of them, soaking in the hot springs and taking long walks through pine forests and making love like newlyweds despite their 50-some-odd years and creaking joints. It was a week outside of time, a chance to remember who they had been before children and responsibility, to reconnect with the essential bond that had formed in a cemetery 30 years prior. "Do you remember what you said to me that first morning?" Eleanor asked as they sat together in one of the hot spring pools, the water warm against their skin and the stars brilliant overhead. "You said that staying rooted in one place, holding on to grief like it was all I had left, would only make the pain last longer." "I remember," Ryder said. "I was afraid I had overstepped, that you would tell me to mind my own business and never speak to you again." "I almost did," Eleanor admitted. "But something about the way you said it, the understanding in your voice, made me listen instead. You were right, of course. If I had kept visiting that grave every day for the rest of my life, I would have been buried right alongside Thomas, not physically, but in every way that mattered." "You saved yourself," Ryder said. "I just reminded you that saving yourself was possible." Eleanor shifted in the water until she was facing him, her hands resting on his shoulders. In the moonlight, she could see the young man he had been beneath the weathered exterior, could trace the line of his jaw, and remember how it had felt to kiss him for the first time by the river all those years ago. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "That is the truth of it. Two broken people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful from the pieces of their shattered lives." Ryder pulled her close, and they floated together in the warm water, holding on to each other and the life they had created, the family they had raised, the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of joy and sorrow and everything in between. They returned to the ranch renewed, ready for whatever years remained to them. Those years proved to be many. Eleanor and Ryder lived into their 70s, a remarkable achievement in a time and place where life was often brutally short. They saw their grandchildren grow and their great-grandchildren born. They watched Miles City transform from a rough cattle town into a proper city with paved streets and electric lights. They witnessed the end of the frontier era and the beginning of something new, something more settled, but perhaps less wild. Through it all, they maintained their connection to the cemetery where they had met. They visited together several times a year, tending the graves of Thomas and Jack Mullins and the other departed souls who rested there. They watched as the cemetery expanded, as new sections were added to accommodate the growing population, as simple wooden markers were replaced by granite monuments. Eleanor never stopped missing Thomas, but the grief had changed over the decades from an open wound to a gentle ache, a reminder of love rather than a source of pain. She told his stories to her grandchildren, keeping his memory alive in the next generation, making sure they knew about the uncle who had brought their grandmother to Montana and whose death had inadvertently led to their existence. On a spring morning in 1914, 30 years after they first met, Eleanor and Ryder made one final trip to the cemetery together. They were both 74 now, frail and slow, but still sharp of mind and devoted to each other. They walked among the graves holding hands, their fingers knotted with arthritis, but their grip strong. "When I die," Eleanor said, breaking a long, comfortable silence, "I want to be buried here, close to Thomas. And I want you beside me when your time comes." "Already arranged it," Ryder said. "Purchased 2 plots next to your brother years ago. Seemed fitting that we should all rest together, the 3 of us who played such important roles in each other's lives." Eleanor smiled, unsurprised. Ryder had always thought ahead, always planned for contingencies, one of the many qualities that had made him such a successful rancher and such a devoted husband. "You have always taken such good care of me." "It has been my greatest honor," Ryder said simply. They stood together beside Thomas's grave, the headstone now moss-covered and ancient-looking, despite being only 30 years old. Eleanor thought about the young woman she had been, 19 and devastated, and certain her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who had refused to let her grieve alone, who had sat beside her morning after morning until she remembered how to live again. She thought about the 30 years of marriage that had followed, the children they had raised, the ranch they had built, the love that had sustained them through every challenge and celebrated with them in every triumph. "It was a good life," she said softly. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that this life with you was everything I could have hoped for, and more than I thought possible when I was kneeling in the dirt beside Thomas's grave." Ryder turned to her, his dark eyes still sharp despite his age, still full of the same love he had shown her from the beginning. "It was the best life," he agreed, "and it is not over yet. We still have time, Eleanor. We still have each other." And they did, for 5 more years. They lived those final years on the ranch surrounded by family, watching their great-grandchildren play in the house that Ryder had built with his own hands, taking pleasure in small things like morning coffee and evening sunsets, and the simple comfort of sleeping beside someone you had loved for nearly 4 decades. Eleanor passed first, in her sleep on a winter night in 1919, her hand clasped in Ryder's. She was 79, and her children later said she looked peaceful, like she was simply dreaming. Ryder mourned her fiercely, visiting her grave in the Miles City Cemetery every single day, just as she had once visited Thomas's, understanding now, in a way he had not fully grasped 35 years earlier, what it meant to lose someone who had been essential to your existence. He followed her 6 months later, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime of hard work and harder winters. His children buried him beside Eleanor, just as he had arranged, with Thomas's grave nearby. The 3 of them reunited in death, as they had been connected in life. On Ryder's headstone, young Thomas had the stonecutter carve a simple epitaph beneath his father's name and dates. He made sure she was not alone anymore. It was a fitting tribute, a summary of the love that had begun in a cemetery and lasted through decades of marriage, a reminder that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is simply our presence, our willingness to sit beside them in their pain and wait patiently while they remember how to hope again. The ranch continued for generations, passed down through the Young family line, and the story of how Eleanor and Ryder met became family legend. Grandchildren told it to their grandchildren, each retelling adding small embellishments but keeping the essential truth intact, that a grieving woman and a kind cowboy had found each other among the dead and built a life more beautiful than either could have imagined. And in the Miles City Cemetery, 3 graves stood together beneath the spreading branches of an ancient cottonwood tree. Thomas Nowell, who had dreamed of the West and died too young. Eleanor Young, who had survived grief and found joy. And Ryder Young, the cowboy who had refused to let her face her sorrow alone and had loved her faithfully until death parted them at last. Together in death as they had been in life, a testament to the healing power of love and the unexpected ways grace can enter our lives when we need it most.